The sky is never silent. Even on the calmest morning above the vast empty Pacific, there is a faint hum in the air, a tension, as if the blue canvas of heaven remembers every machine, every scream, every burst of fire that once passed through it. And perhaps it always will. For in the early years of the Second World War, there was a moment, brief, blinding, unforgettable, when one aircraft ruled that sky with such absolute grace and lethal precision that it seemed almost untouchable. A plane so agile, so weightless, and so perfectly aligned with its warrior pilots that it became more legend than metal. They called it the Zero. To fly it was to feel invincible. To fight it was to question survival. To witness it was to understand how myths are born. In the opening chapters of the Pacific War, the Zero fighter carved its name into history with strokes of fire and wind. It danced through dogfights with impossible turns, gliding like a feather yet striking like a blade. Japanese pilots, trained with relentless discipline and guided by a deep, almost spiritual belief in duty, merged with their machines in a way the world had never seen. Their enemies, scattered across burning seas and collapsing front lines, whispered of it in disbelief. A plane that could outclimb, outturn, and outrun nearly everything America and its allies placed in the sky. For a time, the Zero was the sky. But legends, no matter how bright, cast long shadows. And inside those shadows, storms begin to gather. For across the ocean, engineers, strategists, and young American pilots watched the Zero's dominance with equal parts fear and fascination. They studied its movements, its weaknesses, its design philosophy built on speed over armor, agility over protection. They knew that if the Pacific was to be reclaimed, something had to rise against it, something powerful enough to break the myth. And in quiet workshops in America, beneath steel frames and blueprints smudged with oil and sweat, a new predator began to take shape. A plane built not to dance but to destroy. Not to evade but to endure. The pilots would call it the Hellcat. A name that promised a new kind of fire. But before the Hellcat arrived, before the tide turned, the Zero's story had already been written in the hearts of those who flew it. Men who believed in the machine with a devotion that bordered on sacred. Men who carried the weight of empire, honor, and destiny every time their wheels left the deck of a carrier. This is their story, and the story of the moment the sky changed forever. Perhaps, this was where it all began. Not in the roar of engines or the flare of gunfire, but in the silence of a sky that still remembers. The Pacific Ocean in 1941 was a world of infinity. A horizon so wide, so clean, so brutally empty that a pilot could feel both free and trapped at the same time. Everywhere you looked, water. Endless. Reflective. Alive with sunlight in the day and moonlit silver at night. Carrier decks creaked under the weight of humidity. The smell of heated oil drifted along the wind. Metal rattled as sailors prepared their planes for patrols that stretched over thousands of miles. And far above, a single engine might slice through the air, its echo rolling across the surface like a whisper. It was here, across this impossible battlefield, that Japan sought to carve its empire. And the Zero was its spear. Lightweight, deadly, beautiful in motion. It carried a sense of purpose. Not just as a weapon but as a symbol of national pride. Japan believed deeply in the skill of its pilots, men trained from boyhood to value technique more than anything else. They were molded through exhaustion, discipline, and philosophy. They learned to become extensions of their aircraft, trusting instinct over instruments, fluidity over fear. Early in the war these pilots seemed superhuman. At Pearl Harbor, at Wake Island, at the Philippines, at the battles over Malaya and Burma. The same story repeated again and again. Allied pilots climbed into outdated, slower, heavier aircraft, and met an enemy that moved like a ghost. Eyewitnesses described the Zero as if it defied physics, climbing at angles no American plane could match, turning in circles so tight they looked like illusions, diving with smooth, precise arcs that made escape nearly impossible. For Allied pilots, the first encounters were not battles. They were warnings. Flying against a Zero felt like challenging the wind. Unpredictable. Unrelenting. Alive. But behind every legendary machine stands the human hand, and the human heart. The Zero pilots believed in something larger than themselves. To them, the war was not only a fight for territory, but for a way of life, for honor, for the spirit of the samurai carried into the Age of Steel. Their government promised them glory. Their commanders demanded perfection. Their families expected sacrifice. And so they rose into the sky with a calmness that frightened their enemies. Yet even in those triumphant early days, the seeds of downfall were quietly growing. Japan's training program was brutal, producing only a small number of elite pilots. Replacements were few. Resources stretched thin. Fuel, steel, and rubber became more precious each month. And the Zero itself, for all its elegance, held one fatal flaw. To achieve its breathtaking agility, it had been built with almost no armor. A single burst of enemy fire could ignite it. A few lucky hits could tear it apart. And as new American aircraft began to fill the sky, those weaknesses would become unmistakable. But at this moment in the story, the first phase of the war, none of that mattered. Because nothing had yet challenged the Zero. Nothing had forced Japan to adapt. Nothing had stood in its way. The Pacific was theirs, or so it seemed. Meanwhile, across the ocean, in offices lit by pale lamps and factories echoing with the sound of machinery, American engineers pored over every report, every scrap of intelligence, every detail they could gather about this mysterious Japanese fighter. They studied crash sites, salvaged parts, and pilots' frantic testimonies. And slowly, piece by piece, a picture formed. The Americans didn't just need a new plane. They needed a new philosophy. A machine that didn't try to imitate the Zero, but one that could survive it, overwhelm it, crush it. The first lines of the Hellcats' blueprint were drawn in silence. A silence filled with certainty. The storm was coming. The storm took time to form, but when it finally arrived, it changed everything. In early 1942, the United States found itself fighting a war it had not fully prepared for. The devastation of Pearl Harbor still lingered like smoke in the national mind. Ships lay twisted in the harbor. Families mourned. Pilots trained at breakneck speed. And across the Pacific, the Zero ruled every sky it entered. American commanders needed answers. Not guesses, not temporary fixes. Answers rooted in industry, innovation, and a deeper understanding of the enemy. And one of those answers arrived in the most unexpected way. In June 1942, on a small island in the Aleutians, a Japanese Zero crash-landed almost intact. Its pilot, disoriented and injured, survived long enough to reveal nothing, but the plane itself revealed everything. Engineers swarmed over it like archaeologists discovering an ancient artifact. They measured the wings. They studied the ribs of the frame. They tested the controls, the flaps, the engine's response. And then, they understood. The Zero's strengths were extraordinary. But its weaknesses were fatal. It could turn like a leaf in the wind, yet its lack of armor made it fragile. It could climb like a hawk, yet its fuel lines were exposed. It could strike fast, yet it could not withstand sustained fire. This discovery was not just technical. It was emotional. A shift in confidence. A sense that the myth could be broken. Still, America needed an aircraft capable of delivering that breaking blow. In Bethpage, New York, the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation had already begun work on a fighter intended to replace the older F4F Wildcat. The designers, Leroy Grumman, Bill Schwendler, and a team of tireless engineers, worked day and night. They wanted something rugged. Something forgiving to rookie pilots. Something powerful enough to dominate the mid-war Pacific. They wanted a plane that could take hits and keep flying. A plane that could absorb punishment the Zero never could. What emerged from their drawing boards was a machine of strength rather than elegance. A predator rather than a dancer. The F6F Hellcat. Heavier. Stronger. Faster in a dive. Loaded with firepower. 6.50 caliber machine guns lined its wings, each capable of tearing through metal and flesh in an instant. Its massive Pratt & Whitney engine roared with a deep, confident growl, not the sharp whine of the Zero but something heavier, more grounded, more threatening. The Hellcat did not try to copy the Zero's agility. Instead, it embraced American philosophy: win through durability, firepower, and overwhelming force. When test pilots first took the Hellcat into the sky, they returned with the same uncanny feeling. This plane wants to protect you. This plane wants to keep you alive. In dogfights, survival is everything. Pilots needed confidence as much as speed, and the Hellcat supplied both. By mid-1943, the aircraft rolled off assembly lines at astonishing speed. Grumman became known as the Iron Works, a tribute to both the toughness of its planes and the relentless pace of production. Workers forged steel in the heat of American factories while news from the Pacific grew darker and more urgent. Japan still held vast territory. The Zero still dominated many battles. Young American pilots, some barely out of high school, stepped into the war with only a few months of training. The skies were a graveyard for the unprepared. But that was about to change. As the first squadrons received their Hellcats, something subtle but powerful shifted in the psychology of the American airmen. When they touched the controls, felt the weight of the plane respond to their hands, and heard the engine rumble under them, they sensed a new kind of possibility. Perhaps the Zero could be matched. Perhaps the Pacific would not remain a Japanese domain forever. Perhaps the tide could turn. And then came 1943. A year that would test every belief, every myth, every assumption. When Hellcats met Zeros in their first major encounters, the difference was immediate, not just in performance but in confidence. American pilots no longer entered combat fearing that the enemy was superior in every way. They learned a simple rule: climb and dive, don't turn. Use the Hellcat's strength, not the Zero's game. And slowly, the battlefields began to shift. Over the Solomon Islands. Over Rabaul. Over the Philippines. Young American pilots, many facing their first combat mission, found themselves shooting down Japanese fighters that had once seemed unstoppable. The myth began to crack. But myths don't die quietly. And the Zero still had its masters, pilots with thousands of hours in the cockpit, men who had grown up with the old Japanese naval tradition, warriors who believed the sky itself favored them. They fought back with skill, courage, and a kind of calm ferocity that startled their opponents. Some of these men had survived dozens of dogfights. They knew every edge of their aircraft, every shadow of a cloud, every trick of angle and altitude. For them, the war was not simply duty. It was destiny. And destiny is not easily surrendered. Even as the Hellcat gained dominance, these elite Japanese aviators refused to yield. They flew into impossible odds, outnumbered and outgunned, trusting in experience and instinct. But war is not a place for legends alone. It is a place for logistics, numbers, replacements, fuel, industry. And here, Japan began to suffer in ways the pilots could feel in their bones. Veteran aces were killed faster than they could be replaced. Training schools rushed students into battle with a fraction of the hours once required. Fuel shortages forced limits on practice flights. Aircraft quality began to falter. Engines became unreliable. The Zero, once a masterpiece of early war engineering, now faced enemies built with late war technology and overwhelming industrial power. The Pacific sky was becoming a different place, one that valued endurance over elegance. Perhaps this was the turning point, the moment when the myth of invincibility met the reality of war. And for the first time, Zero pilots looked into the eyes of American aviators and saw not fear, but determination. A kind of steady, rising certainty. The Hellcat had arrived. And it had already changed the game. Yet even now, beneath the thunder of engines and the clash of philosophies, something deeper unfolded. A human story shared by both sides. Young men, thousands of miles from home, fighting in a sky so beautiful that it almost contradicted the violence unfolding within it. Somewhere underneath the strategy and the steel, there were hearts beating, dreams waiting, families praying. The sky held all of it, hope and terror, pride and loss. And soon, it would witness one of the greatest aerial turning points in history. The moment when the Hellcat did more than challenge the Zero. The moment when it ended the era of the myth forever. War is often told through numbers, aircraft counts, kill ratios, distances measured in miles and fuel range. But within the Zero and the Hellcat, the war was lived by men who carried those numbers as weight on their shoulders. For a pilot, the cockpit was both sanctuary and coffin. A place where fear had no room because any hesitation could mean death. And yet, fear was always there, breathing quietly beneath the mask, waiting in the silence between missions. For the Japanese pilots, flying the Zero was more than skill. It was identity. It was honor. It was the last thread connecting them to everything they had been taught to believe. From childhood, many had been raised on the virtues of sacrifice, duty, loyalty. The belief that the ultimate expression of love for one's nation was to give everything, even life, without question. Inside the narrow cockpit of a Zero, the world felt impossibly close. Bare metal. A thin canopy. Instruments that rattled with every change in pressure. The smell of fuel and salt mixing in the air. The sea flashing beneath at terrifying speed. Pilots describe feeling the aircraft as an extension of their own body. A living creature. Responsive. Intuitive. Trusted. Its fragility was known but rarely spoken of. Armor was sacrificed for agility. Self-sealing fuel tanks were considered unnecessary weight. To the outside world, this made the Zero vulnerable. But to the pilots, it was the price of perfection. They believed skill mattered more than survival. Agility mattered more than protection. Victory mattered more than returning home. And although the world remembers the ferocity of their missions, fewer remember the softer details. The letters written in quiet moments before flight, the photographs tucked into pockets, the dreams whispered to friends under starlit carrier decks. Many believed they would not live to see old age. And they accepted that. But the war was changing faster than their traditions could adapt. On the other side of the ocean, young American pilots stepped into their Hellcats with a very different psychology. Many were barely 20. Some had never seen the ocean until they boarded ships headed toward it. Their training was fast, intense, and modern, grounded in engineering, physics, and tactical doctrine. They didn't enter the war with the same fatalistic acceptance. They wanted to survive, to return home, to grow old, to live. Inside the Hellcat, the space felt different, wider, sturdier, armored. The metal was thicker. The canopy was reinforced. The controls felt heavy, reliable, predictable. It was a machine built to protect its pilot as much as to destroy its enemy. They were taught something the Japanese could not afford. If you live, you fight again. If you survive, you learn. If you learn, you win. In the early encounters between Hellcats and Zeros, the emotional collision was just as powerful as the physical one. American pilots were stunned by the Japanese precision and discipline. Japanese pilots were stunned by the Hellcat's durability, how it absorbed gunfire and refused to fall. One American pilot summarized the difference in a single line: "We fought men who weren't afraid to die, in planes that weren't afraid to live." This contrast shaped every battle. Imagine the moment just before combat. The engines roaring like caged animals. The sun glinting off the wings. The wind slicing across the canopy. Hands trembling, then steadying. A deep breath held for half a second too long. And then contact. A speck in the distance becomes a shape. A shape becomes a threat. A threat becomes an enemy. Two fighters close the distance. The world narrows. Speed increases. The mind empties. Training takes over. For Zero pilots, the first maneuver was always the same. Turn inside the enemy. Force them into your circle. Use agility as the blade. For Hellcat pilots, the rule was unshakable. Don't turn. Climb. Dive. Strike. Escape. Two philosophies in direct opposition. One based on fluidity, the other on power. But beneath these tactics lay something deeper. Fear. Hope. Resolve. The quiet humanity of men fighting for visions larger than themselves. Japanese pilots carried the weight of a nation expecting miracle after miracle. American pilots carried the hopes of families praying they would return. And somewhere above the Pacific, their paths crossed in a dance of life and death, split-second decisions determining who would live to see another sunrise. By 1944, the battles grew larger. Carrier groups multiplied. Aircraft swarmed the sky in waves. The war moved toward its brutal climax. And then came a moment historians still speak of in awe: the Battle of the Philippine Sea. American pilots call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a name that fails to capture the tragedy on the other side. For Japan, it was a catastrophe. Squadrons of young, barely trained pilots were thrown into battles they were not prepared to face. Their commanders knew the risks. They knew how little experience these young men had. But they had no choice. The Empire needed them. Imagine being 18 years old, sitting in a Zero for the first time in combat. Hands shaking. Sweat pooling beneath the mask. Engines screaming loud enough to drown your heartbeat. And then, seeing dozens of Hellcats climbing toward you, machines you had been warned were nearly indestructible in skilled hands. Many of those young Japanese pilots never stood a chance. The Hellcat tore through the sky with a confidence born from months of training and thousands of hours of industrial supremacy. American pilots, once outmatched, were now experienced, well-armed, and flying aircraft designed for victory. The Zero's agility no longer mattered. The battles were fought at speeds and altitudes that favored power, not elegance. When the smoke cleared, the myth, the idea that the Zero was unbeatable, dissolved. But even then, Japanese pilots continued to fight with remarkable bravery. Some of the elites, the last of the old guard, pushed their aircraft beyond all limits to protect the inexperienced men behind them. They fought with a fierce grace that stunned American flyers. One American aviator would later write, "They flew like ghosts. Like men who knew their world was ending, and refused to let it go without a final cry." This is the tragedy of every war. Strength alone does not determine victory. Courage alone does not guarantee survival. Skill alone does not shape destiny. War chooses its winners not by heart, but by supply lines, factories, fuel, timing, numbers. And yet, in the chaos, it is always the human stories that linger longest. The Zero pilot who refused to eject until his wingman escaped. The American pilot who risked fuel to guide a damaged comrade home. The Japanese ace who saluted his opponent before his final dive. The young Hellcat flyer who whispered a prayer before every takeoff. These moments remind us that behind every engine roar, every burst of tracers, every plume of rising smoke, there are people, fragile, hopeful, terrified, determined people. As 1944 turned into 1945, the war moved toward its inevitable end. But the emotional weight carried by those who fought in the sky stayed with them forever. Some would never speak of it again. Some would spend their lives trying to understand it. Some would never return home to ponder anything at all. And the sky, that vast blue witness, held all their stories in silence. As the final year of the Pacific War unfolded, the skies that once shimmered with the pride of Japan's finest aviators became heavy with a difficult truth. The age of the Zero, once glorious, graceful, feared, was fading. Not because its pilots had lost their courage or their devotion, but because the world had changed faster than anyone had imagined. And war does not forgive those who cannot change with it. The Hellcat, the machine born from necessity and hardened by industrial might, now filled the horizon with a different sound. A deeper, heavier roar that signaled a shift not only in technology but in destiny. By 1945, the carriers of the U.S. Navy moved across the Pacific like floating cities, launching air groups larger than entire Japanese fleets. American pilots flew with confidence, supported by resources, intelligence, radar, and a machine that wanted to protect them. Japanese pilots, especially the few veterans who remained, saw the truth with heartbreaking clarity. They were fighting a battle that bravery alone could not win. They watched younger men barely qualified to fly, climb into Zeros for missions with no return. They saw the spirit that once defined them, precision, patience, mastery, swallowed by the desperation of a nation running out of time. Some fought with everything they had left. Others fought with the quiet acceptance of men fulfilling their final duty. But all of them understood the weight of the moment. The end of an era is never loud. It does not announce itself with triumph or tragedy. It arrives slowly, quietly, as a realization. A realization that the sky they once ruled now belonged to another generation, another machine, another philosophy. For many Zero pilots, the war ended not in fire but in silence. Grounded aircraft, empty fuel tanks, hangars abandoned, a once proud air arm reduced to memory. And yet, their legacy did not vanish. Even their former enemies spoke of their skill with reverence. American pilots, years after the war, would tell stories not of killing machines but of fighting warriors. Men who flew with an elegance unmatched, with a discipline so refined that it felt almost otherworldly. In interviews decades later, some American aces admitted something quietly. We didn't beat the Zero pilots. We beat the system around them. It was logistics, production, fuel, steel, factories, training hours, all of the invisible elements of war, that ultimately decided the outcome. But the men inside those machines, they were equals. They were reflections of each other, born in different worlds, shaped by different ideals, yet connected by the same sky. And perhaps that is the deepest truth of this story. That above the gunfire, above the politics, above the shifting tides of victory and defeat, there were human hearts beating inside fragile cockpits, each one trying to survive a war so much larger than themselves. The Hellcat pilots returned home to families, to weddings, to children, to quiet lives rebuilt after chaos. Many kept their flight jackets stored in closets for decades. Some spoke of their missions with pride, others never spoke of them at all. The Zero pilots who survived the war faced a different world when they returned. Cities were ashes. The empire they fought for was gone. Their aircraft, the symbols of their youth, their pride, their sacrifice, lay destroyed across runways and jungles. Some became commercial pilots. Some became teachers. Some never touched an aircraft again. But each carried the memory of a time when their hands held the controls of a legend, and the sky belonged to them. Years later, when historians tried to explain the rise and fall of these iconic machines, they often focused on design and technology, on horsepower, on turning radius, on climb rate, on the things that can be written on charts and measured with rulers. But the deeper story cannot be measured, because it lives not in steel but in spirit. It lives in the young Japanese aviator who felt the wind on his face as he launched from a carrier deck at dawn, believing he was defending a nation's honor. It lives in the young American pilot who sat in his Hellcat, breathing slowly to steady his hands, promising himself he would live long enough to write a letter home. It lives in the skies above the Pacific, thick with clouds and sunlight, where two extraordinary machines clashed again and again, each one flown by someone who believed in their own way that they were fighting for something worth dying for. And as we look back now, across the distance of decades, the lesson becomes clearer. War is not just a story of winners and losers. It is the story of human beings pushed to their limits, shaped by forces they cannot control, and bound by hopes that stretch far beyond the battlefield. The Zero taught the world about grace, precision, and the heights of human skill. The Hellcat taught the world about resilience, power, and the might of innovation. Together they formed a chapter of history written not just in victory or defeat, but in courage, the kind of courage that survives long after the gunfire fades. Today, when the sun sets over the Pacific, its reflection on the water looks almost like polished aluminum, the same shine that once glinted from wings slicing through the air. If you stand on a quiet shore and listen closely, you might almost imagine the distant echo of engines, the faint heartbeat of a past that still lingers in the wind. Perhaps that is the final truth. Machines grow old. Empires rise and fall. Strategies evolve. New generations replace the old. But the sky remembers. It remembers the Zero pilots who believed they were untouchable. It remembers the Hellcats that proved even legends can be broken. It remembers every burst of tracer fire, every desperate climb, every last whispered prayer. And it remembers the courage, on both sides, of those who gave everything they had in a war that shaped the world we live in today. In the end, the Zero was not defeated by the Hellcat alone. It was defeated by time, by change, by the weight of history turning its page. But the myth did not disappear. It simply transformed. From fear to respect. From dominance to memory. From legend to legacy. And as long as people look to the sky and wonder what it felt like to fly in those desperate, brilliant years, the story will live on. For myths do not die. They evolve. They shift. They find new meaning in those who remember them. And so, the Zero and the Hellcat, two icons born from opposite worlds, remain forever bound in the endless, eternal sky. A sky that holds their story. A sky that holds their echo. A sky that holds their truth.